Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and I have the distinct pleasure today of getting to interview Dr. David Ley, who is the author of The Myth of Sex Addiction. Dr. David Ley is a clinical psychologist in practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He is the executive director of a large outpatient mental health and substance abuse program in Albuquerque. He has been treating sexuality issues throughout his career. First began treating perpetrators and victims of sexual abuse, but has expanded his approach to include the fostering and promotion of healthy sexuality and awareness of the wide range of normative sexual behaviors. He's published 2 books, and today we'll be talking mostly about the myth of sex addiction. But welcome to the program, Dr. Ley.
Thanks for having me on, Natasha.
Thrilled to have you. Would you like to expound on your bio at all? Tell us a little bit about your background, or?
Sure. I'm a little different than a lot of the folks that are out there treating, writing, and advocating about sex addiction. Overwhelmingly, those therapists are self-identified sex addicts who got into providing sex addiction therapy after they had run into sexual problems themselves, and then they connected with the sex addiction industry and then became sex addiction therapists. As a result, they really only have experience with their own sexual health problems or in treating other people who are coming to them and saying they are a sex addict and having sexual health problems. The place where I'm different is that I am a general psychologist. My agency, we treat chronic mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. We treat a large range of serious substance use issues with heroin addiction and opioid addiction, with methamphetamine, etc. And sometimes we see sexual health issues, and I have, for many years worked with alternative sexuality folks that are into, kind of various sort of sexual groups like bondage and discipline or swingers and stuff like that. But as a result, I don't have the sample bias. And what I mean by that is that I see a wide range of people with a wide range of issues, and some of those people are having sexual health problems. Some of the people that are having other problems might have sexual health issues that are just a symptom of their problems. It's easier for me to take that broad picture because I'm seeing all of these different kinds of people. In contrast, folks that are working with sex addiction, they're only really seeing that little sample group of people who are identifying their sexual problem as the problem. It gives me a broader perspective, and in a lot of ways, that is one of the biggest challenges that I have brought against the kind of sex addiction industry, is to say that you guys are too stuck in your niche. You need to get out of the box and see the very real, significant behavioral health problems that lots of other people are experiencing. And once you do that, once you're dealing with a person with schizophrenia or a person with, severe PTSD that is, absolutely crippling their life and their job and everything else, a person who is masturbating to porn starts to not look quite so significant.
This is very relevant, especially in the culture that I work within, because I think that we tend to make a big deal about sexual impropriety or sexuality that doesn't fit into the standards and expectations that the religion puts forth. This has been one of my concerns that I talk about often, is that I see the first part of the problem being that we take what I think most psychologists would see as normative behavior, such as masturbation, some porn use, some maybe non-traditional sexuality, and we, in a sense, pathologize that so that people are seeking treatment that really, and labeling themselves as addicts that really don't meet any significant clinical distress other than their own because of the implications that the religion or their spouses or their family systems impose upon them. Or the other extreme is that you will see people who really probably do have more choice in the matter, or don't recognize the choice they have in the matter, but in a sense, the sexual addiction label can then be a pass. Like, well, I can't help it. I'm diseased. I have I have a problem that's infiltrated in my brain, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, I both of those are issues that I talk a lot about, and I actually, for the past few months, I've been traveling the country, and I'm providing trainings to therapists around the country on how to address issues of modern sexuality, including things like pornography, in their practice. And one of the things I'm finding is that, frankly, the issue is much worse than I even thought. I mean, we have known for a long time that most mental health therapists receive very little training in sexuality issues. We knew that, but I'll be honest, I didn't know how bad it was. And at this point, I would argue strongly that around 5% of therapists have received any sexuality training beyond how to diagnose a fetish or a paraphilic disorder, the disorders like exhibitionism or frauderism or sadism that are in the DSM that we use to diagnose mental disorders. That's all the training most people get. Now, what that means is that therapists are then subject to their own bias. They make the decision around sexual health. When a patient describes their sexuality issues to them, they make the decision as to whether or not it's healthy based upon whether they, the therapist, would do it. Kinsey, the famous sex researcher, he said it best, that the definition of a nymphomaniac is anybody who has more sex than the therapist. The same is true for sex addiction, that we really are telling and allowing therapists to pathologize sexuality based solely upon their own personal experience. Most therapists don't read clinical journals and don't read research. So as a result, they are basing their decisions about sexuality issues on the same popular media that everybody else sees, reads, and understands. That's a big problem because the popular media treats sexuality as an anxiety-inducing, fear-based kind of process that they use to sell people stuff, because by inducing anxiety in the audience, they get to grab their attention and then show them commercials. So the fact that therapists are basing their clinical decisions upon that information is really staggering. The other concern is that it turns out that mental health gets this stuff wrong a lot. So I mentioned the DSM and the paraphilic disorders and things like exhibitionism and frauderism, transvestism, etc. Those were classified as disorders, basically about 100 years ago, or a little bit more than that, on the idea that these were sexually uncommon and relatively rare alternative or non-traditional sexual behaviors or desires. A research study was done and published just a few weeks ago from Quebec in Canada, where lead researcher was a guy named Joyal, Joyal, and they published research where they actually reached out to people in Canada that were not going to therapy. They were just random people. They called them up or they went to them on the internet, and they found out that half of the people they talked to, or they talked to several thousand people, half of them expressed interest in some of these behaviors or sexual desires that we think are uncommon. And 30% of them had actually engaged in those behaviors. So it really shakes up the idea that therapists kind of know what we're talking about when it comes to sex. Because it turns out that the only reason we thought those things were rare or uncommon was because people weren't telling us about them. people didn't talk about them because of the shame and the fear, the stigma attached to sex. Society right now is changing. You know, you look at the popularity of 50 Shades of Grey and you look at the gay marriage change in the United States as evidence that our attitudes towards sex are really changing dramatically. Therapy has not yet caught up. We are still pathologizing sexual diversity in a way that is based on bias and not based on research or even actual health-related issues.
Yeah, just in the last few weeks, we've had Utah create this concept of a public health crisis with pornography viewing. We have really internationally renowned therapists like John Gottman, who's actually very respected in many areas, and I respect his work. But at the same time, he's making statements about pornography that are really not substantiated by research.
Mm-hmm.
Popular media, like you say, is one article after another that claims all these big words: neuroscience, research, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we start making sense of all this information? And when you say that you haven't, that there really isn't the research to support it, what are you talking about?
Well, to clarify, the idea of sex addiction is a concept that was really created back in the early 1980s as our society was struggling with a couple of things. One of the things was AIDS and HIV, and all of a sudden, secret male sexuality, and especially male gay sexuality, was seen as not just immoral, but potentially deadly. That's when sex addiction, and pornography was first called a public health crisis. You know, the idea that Utah is kind of being new right now by calling this a health issue is frankly not new at all. That strategy has now been around for decades. It's a way to distract and a way to say, oh, look, this is not, this isn't just about us disagreeing with your morality. This is about us trying to protect you from the dangers of sex. I mean, in the 1980s, the Meese Commission, reviewed pornography. Judith Reisman is a professor who testified to Congress about the, quote, erototoxins that were released in people's brains when they watched pornography. And she argued that these erototoxins rotted people's brains and made them addicted to pornography, and made them immoral because of the negative neurological effects of pornography. None of this is new, and all of it, again, reflects a social response and a social reaction to changing sexual and social issues in our society. The other thing that was changing around the same time was that we shifted from a society that allowed powerful men to engage in as much sex as they wanted and get away with it, to have mistresses and harems and everything else. And we became a society that said, no, that's not fair. We shouldn't allow men to have different sexual rights than we give to women. And so if a woman is going to get in trouble for infidelity, a man should too. John F. Kennedy had more sex in and out of the White House than Bill Clinton ever dreamed of. John F. Kennedy famously said to the French president that if Kennedy didn't have sex with a different woman every day, that he got headaches. But Bill Clinton had oral sex in the White House and was called a sex addict. The reason is that these social changes happened, and the unfortunate thing is that the idea of sex addiction follows these social issues, and it's not based on research that really supports that this thing is real. So the American Psychiatric Association has rejected the concept of sex addiction for 40 years now, has consistently said over and over and over again that there is no science. Some of the most recent research, just a couple of years ago, that actually looked at what do these people in sex addiction treatment actually look like, really confirmed a lot of the things that I'm saying. It found that 90 to 95% of these sex addicts are men. Over half of them are white men who make over $85,000 a year, and gay and bi men are at 3 times the risk of being called a sex addict. So the sex addiction industry and the sex addiction concept is still continuing that thread of both pathologizing male homosexual behavior and desires, treating it as an illness, and offering an excuse to these powerful, wealthy men who get caught being sexually irresponsible or making selfish, narcissistic kind of decisions around their sexuality. And then when they get in trouble, they say, oh, it's a disease. My sex addiction made me do this. So in Michigan right now, there is a state prosecutor who had made a career of attacking prostitution, and his real political stance was against prostitution. Well, then just a couple of months ago, he got caught soliciting prostitutes, and it turns out that he has been soliciting prostitutes this whole time. He is now going to sex addiction treatment to try to avoid responsibility for his actions and his hypocrisy, and to blame his actions on this alleged disease. It's all a stage show at that point. It's all a just kind of way to manipulate social opinion. The unfortunate thing is when mental health and healthcare kinds of concepts are used to support that. I have a big problem with that. I also have a big problem with the degree to which these pseudo-scientific kinds of concepts are then used in court to manipulate juries, and again to help people avoid responsibility for their actions. Sadly, there are lots of people who have committed sex offenses and legitimate sex crimes like rape and sexual abuse. But then in court, they argue that they're a sex addict, and instead of going to jail, they get sent to a sex addiction treatment program. Now, there's an important thing that your listeners need to understand about these sex addiction treatment programs, and I know that Utah actually has a lot of them.
A lot, and they're growing. Yes,
which is really concerning to me, because there is not a single published study that shows that these sex addiction treatment programs have an effect. There's not a single shred of evidence that these, residential sex addiction programs, or even that outpatient sex addiction therapy helps people to make different choices, to understand themselves better, that it changes their quality of life. That is a big problem, and it's a bigger problem because sex addiction, because it's not a real disorder, cannot be billed to your health insurance.
And it's expensive.
And it's expensive. So the therapists, bill people cash. And many of these people are desperate. They are in trouble because they were sexually inappropriate at work, or because they were having infidelity issues with their wife, and they are desperate to have something to hang their hat on. And I'm sad to say that I think it's exploitive that these sex addiction treatment programs are exploiting people, telling them that they can treat their sex addiction, that they can make it better, and there's no evidence that they can. I think that's unethical. At best, sex addiction providers should be telling their patients that sex addiction treatment is experimental, because there's no evidence that it works. There's no evidence it's a real disorder. They should be allowing their patient to make informed consent and make a good decision based upon the evidence. But unfortunately, they don't. And again, I think that's a problem, especially when we see, what's happening in Utah right now, where people are, the legislature and the governor are saying that, porn and porn addiction are a public health crisis. That's troubling to me, because instead of looking at the issues of sexual education, instead of looking at what these problems with sex and porn actually mean, they are focused on the porn. I call it sneezing disorder. If I walk into my doctor and I say, and I'm sneezing, and I say, doctor, I can't stop sneezing, my doctor isn't going to diagnose me with sneezing disorder. Instead, he's going to try and figure out, do I have a bacterial infection? Do I have a virus? Do I have allergies? Or perhaps, do I even have that genetic condition that when I walk out into bright sunlight, I sneeze? It is really important to figure out which it is, because I need my doctor to treat it based upon what the actual cause of my sneezing is. But he's not going to tell me, David, you just need to stop sneezing and then things will get better. Unfortunately, that's what the idea of porn addiction is doing. I think that when we look at where are these problems really coming from, we find a few things. And I think these are the things that therapists really should be looking at, and what people who are calling themselves porn addicts or sex addicts really need help with. First, as I said, these are mostly men. And there is a significant difference between men and women in many areas. But one of the areas is men use sex more often as a stress management tool and as a coping strategy for negative emotions. Now, men in our society don't have a lot of opportunity to even talk about negative emotions, much less to ask for help in dealing with them. I think that's sad. Men are just told, suck it up, deal with it, be a man. Now, for years, there has been lots of research that looks at men that are using high levels of pornography, for instance, or going to prostitutes a lot, and has found that these men more often have significantly high levels of depression, stress, and anxiety. So for a long time, people like the sex and porn addiction therapists have been saying, aha, see, look, porn and sex is causing this depression. It's causing this stress. So they did some longitudinal studies where they looked at people over time instead of just a cross-sectional study, which looks at people in a snapshot in time. And in these longitudinal studies, they have found consistently that in men, and young males, teenagers as well, that pornography always comes second. What comes first are the negative emotions. So there is a single life event that I oftentimes talk about that in men overwhelmingly predicts an increase in pornography use. Can you guess what that might be?
I don't know. I can guess in the Mormon construct, it's the 12-year-old who goes into the bishop and gets asked about pornography use.
Oh, that's sad. In men, it's divorce.
Divorce.
Because if you think about it, a married man who, was in a relationship that was, most often sexual, and now he's alone, and he's lonely, and he's depressed, and he's sad, and he's horny too. And so he starts using more pornography. Now, pornography didn't cause the divorce, pornography didn't cause the depression, but pornography use and masturbation can be an effective way for a man to manage those feelings. When I see men come into my office who are struggling with porn-related problems, they're worried that they're using porn too much, their wife thinks they're using porn too much, or they got in trouble for porn at work, overwhelmingly, these men have very diminished levels of coping mechanisms. They have fewer coping strategies to deal with these negative feelings. And they're using porn to manage boredom, to manage stress, to manage depression, to just make themselves feel better. The problem there is not the porn. The problem is that these men need some other ways to cope with and deal with those feelings. But if we blame porn and if we take porn away from those guys without giving them some additional tools to now manage those feelings, in many cases we are making the problem worse. Unfortunately, the sex addiction and porn addiction kind of approach is to do exactly that. First, you got to stop watching the porn. Well, oftentimes that is actually going to increase these men's problems, not make it better. The second thing, and then this really relates to Utah, in men who are struggling with the idea of porn addiction and believe that they are using too much porn, consistently we find that they are not using more porn than anyone else, but they come from a moral background. They come from a family background that pathologized sex and porn and said sex and porn are immoral. Now, this is one place where Patrick Carnes, the inventor of sex addiction, and I actually agree. In 1983, on the Phil Donahue show, Patrick Carnes said that he believed that sex addiction was the result of growing up in a religious household where they did not talk about sex. I agree, because in today's world, people have the ability to engage in sexual behavior, to seek out sexual stimulation privately, out of social control, in a way like we have never seen before. Through the internet, people can now reach out and seek out that sexual information in a way that conflicts with their ideas of what healthy or proper sex is based on their family. And because we're not giving these young people sex education, they don't understand what normal sexuality is. I mean, I've literally had a man sitting in my office, a young college student, who had grown up as a Mormon and grown up in a very conservative family, and he came to me in tears because he was a porn addict and because he thought he was masturbating too much, and he was not even taking showers because he didn't want to be naked with himself. For fear of losing control. When we really got down to it, we found that he was masturbating about once a month.
Yeah.
But he believed that any masturbation, any pornography use was immoral and a sign of addiction.
Right.
Now, I
this
think
is
that
very
we need
common,
to be,
by the way, in
yeah,
my practice, and because we really do not have any within the Mormon construct. There's no allowance for, oh well, it's just a little bit, right? It's abstinence only.
all or none.
It's all or none, and so then that really sets up a lot of people for just automatic failure.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we need to help those people who are struggling with that, who are really left out in the cold, because they feel like their sexual desires are this thing inside them that the more they try to control them, the stronger they get. I get that. But the answer to that, the way to help that, is not to tell them to further control those sexual desires or to tell them that their sexual desires are a disease. Sadly, that makes it worse. I think that, we need to help people understand the range of sexual diversity. We need to help people understand, well, you may be one of those people who has a higher libido, and so now you need help figuring out which of your moral beliefs that you were raised with do you want to incorporate into your adult identity and your approach to your life. How do you want to be a moral person in your life? Now, as an adult, we get to make our own decisions. We get to decide, ideally, which of those beliefs do we want to follow. And I see this with lesbian and gay and bisexual patients that I work with who've grown up in a religious household, whether it's Mormon or not, and they are now trying to wrestle with and understand, how can I be this person and accept myself and reconcile it with these moral beliefs? That is a more sophisticated conversation that is not focused on the sex, but it's focused on the conflict. Where is the conflict? And in so many people, the conflict is between their sexual desires and their sexual opportunities and the moral beliefs that they were raised with. We can help those people, and we need to help those people. But pointing the finger at the porn and the sex is just a distraction.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful and very much in line with my experience, as a therapist working primarily with LDS clients for most of my career. So tell us a little bit about, how did you come about writing this book? I mean, obviously you've shared a lot of your thoughts and feelings about the problems, and then maybe even some of the response you've received.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, I as I said, I'm a traditional psychologist, and I run a large mental health agency, and I deal all day long with state bureaucrats and with managed care organizations, trying to help my patients get services. And that's a hard, sad, tough thing to do sometimes. Back in 2008, I was clinically depressed. I was banging my head against the wall, and I was really tired of it. And I needed something to kind of sink my teeth into, something that I could do that didn't really depend on the bureaucrats. And I ran into a couple of couples, in fact, who were living a very unique sexual lifestyle. It's a form of swinging, and it's about sexual promiscuity. Nothing had ever been written about it at an academic level. I thought it was really interesting. And I will share that when I first ran into these couples clinically, my first impression, my first thought was to say, wow, that's kind of crazy, because in these lifestyles, the wife was very promiscuous and the husband was monogamous and encouraging the wife to be promiscuous. My initial thought was, wow, that's got to be unhealthy. But then I had to stop myself, and I questioned, why did I think that? Because both of these couples were remarkably healthy. Both of them had marriages decades long, healthy families, healthy lifestyles, healthy careers, and remarkably healthy kind of communication and relationship skills. And so I had to say, where did that judgment come from in me? How did I end up there? And so I ended up writing a book about this lifestyle. It's called Insatiable Wives, and I really investigated, where does this lifestyle come from? Where do these desires come from? How did these people end up with this very unique kind of sexual lifestyle? And is it healthy or not? In the book, I talked about one guy who had, destroyed a couple of marriages because he was really obsessed and interested with his wife having sex with other men. And in the book, I said, just kind of in passing, oh, it'd be really easy to diagnose this guy as a sex addict, but I don't believe in sex addiction. It's not a real disorder. Well, as I started doing publicity for that book, interestingly, the media was a lot more interested in talking about that and my disbelief in sex addiction than they were interested in talking about female sexuality, which was the focus of that book. So I said, wow, again, I said, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe sex addiction is real. Maybe I should give this a second look. So I did. I spent the next year and a half again reading, writing, interviewing, traveling the country, learning everything I could about the sex addiction industry and where it came from and what these beliefs were and whether it was good treatment or not. I ended up arguing and believing that sex addiction was not only not real, but dangerous, that it reflected a very troubling intrusion of social morality into medicine. And, throughout history, in the 1800s, the belief that masturbation was unhealthy and a mental disorder and disease led to awful things being done to children. The belief that women who like sex just as much as men were nymphomaniacs and were disordered led to women being hospitalized and had lobotomies done to them. Throughout history, every time we allow these sexual values to intrude into our mental health practice, we hurt people. My belief as a therapist is that we shouldn't hurt people. And, a dear friend of mine is a writer, a very accomplished and successful writer. And he said to me, David, I will never trust a therapist because in 1969, when he came out to his parents as gay, he was put in a psychiatric hospital for 18 months. And he said, I wasn't depressed or violent or suicidal when I went in the hospital, but I was after I'd been there 6 months. We did that to him. Our industry allowed people to be hurt based on our sexual values. I think we have to take responsibility for that and prevent that from ever happening again. So I argue that in the book, in The Myth of Sex Addiction, and then I began writing and speaking about it, and I got tremendous backlash. I've been threatened with lawsuit probably as many as 10 times now, simply for challenging this concept. I get death threats. People have attacked me. People have attacked my wife. People have attacked my family just because they don't like the idea that I am disagreeing with this concept. Now, remember where I started. Most of the people who believe in sex addiction and treat sex addiction are themselves identified as sex addicts. So when somebody like me comes out and challenges this concept, I'm challenging not just their clinical practice, I'm challenging and undermining their identity. And that is a terrifying thing for them, because they cling to this identity as being the only way that they believe they can control themselves and maintain a healthy life. Mm-hmm. That's sad, and I understand their fear, but it doesn't justify, unfortunately, the vitriol and the anger, and it doesn't justify or excuse when they hurt people. And sadly, they are. I think that, there's even research now showing that the belief in porn addiction, a person believing that they are a porn addict, actually makes them worse and increases depression and anxiety over time, regardless of how much porn a person actually watches. That's really sad because, again, therapists are not supposed to hurt people, and we shouldn't be diagnosing something in people that is making things worse. I get really concerned and scared when I see things like happening in Utah right now, where legislators and governments are using these very poorly constructed subjective scientific concepts to justify their restrictions on other people's sexual behaviors. That makes me nervous. It makes me a little afraid of what their motivations are, but it makes me deeply angry when they are using my field, when they're using my profession to justify hurting other people, because that's not the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah, and you might think this isn't such a big deal, people's sexuality, but it's huge. I mean, we have stories where, we've had adolescents kill themselves over masturbation guilt. I mean, that is atrocious. That's atrocious. That's happening in our culture. And just even how we set it up for marriages. We set it up so that, not trying to minimize the trauma that comes with some betrayal in a marriage, or not, figuring out what your sexual contract is going to be, and maybe somebody's been secretive, but we set it up so that the wife generally feels like, okay, I caught my husband looking at porn, our marriage is over, or this person needs to get addiction help or else I cannot stay with him. So these are the messages that it's not people just having a kerfuffle about their sex life. It's we're teaching people how to respond to the sexual crises that we're in a sense creating.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We what are the things that people struggle with most in life? Sex and money. And we're not teaching people to understand or talk about these things. We're not teaching marriages and people in relationships to really dialogue about what is it like to be married in the modern world with all of these kind of sexual opportunities in front of us. Couples don't talk about what is infidelity. Now, because they think, oh yeah, it's simple. It's sex. If you have sex with somebody else, that's infidelity, that's cheating. But in the modern world, we have to recognize that what is sex? Bill Clinton was arguing about whether oral sex was sex or not. If I have a cyber relationship with a person online that I never meet, is that cheating or not? What if that person that I have the cyber relationship with is actually not a real person, but is just a computer program that is sending me letters pretending to be a real person? Is that cheating or not? Unfortunately, we don't encourage people to have these kinds of conversations and dialogues because we go into marriages and relationships with our eyes just full of stars and believing the ideal. Well, the ideal might have worked back 300 or 400 years ago when we lived in a village with 150 people. But now we interact with 150 people on Facebook every day. We live in a different world, and our values have not caught up. Sadly, people are getting caught in between. I desperately think that, we need our pastors and our ministers to really engage with us in a dialogue about what is sexual integrity, what is sexual health. There's a group called the Religious Institute, and they're actually a consortium of almost 5,000 ministers, priests, pastors from around the world who have come together and said, sexuality is one of the issues that our congregations are struggling with the most, and we need to figure out how to have a better conversation with our congregation about these issues. Instead of saying that this sex act or that sex act, whether it's infidelity or homosexuality or this or that, instead of saying those things are bad, immoral, or unhealthy, instead they are saying we need to figure out how to encourage people to have integrity in their sexual behaviors. We need to encourage people to use responsibility and respect in their treatment of others and themselves with their sexual behaviors. And so, if you want to watch pornography and you can do so in a respectful, responsible position of personal integrity, then that's healthy. If you can use porn ethically, or if you can live in an open relationship, if you can say to your partner, I really love you, but sometimes I'm attracted to other people, and it really would help me to have the ability to engage in that kind of relationship. Can we figure out a way to make that work? That's integrity. And in some ways, the Religious Institute is arguing that's morality. Not, did you do this or do that? Because in today's world, that kind of objective definition doesn't really work anymore. We like to pretend that sex is simple. We like to pretend that we have control and understanding of our sexuality. Unfortunately, sex is not simple. Sex is very, very complicated. And in certain cases, we have a lot less control over our sexual behaviors and desires than we would all like to pretend. I think we need to move into a conversation where we help people to understand that, to embrace that, and to use that as they make personal decisions. Therapists should be helping with that. Therapists should be helping people to understand, yes, when you are horny and lonely in the middle of the night, you are prone to making bad decisions because that's what people do when they are horny and lonely. The thing to do is to find a way to make good decisions that you will feel better about early on. Sam Brownback is the governor of Kansas now, and he was a state senator in D.C. for a long time, and he held hearings about the dangers of pornography. And one of the things he said in those hearings was he knew these men who, when they checked into a hotel, they had to have the television removed so that they would not be tempted to watch pornography in the middle of the night. Now, Brownback said, look at that. See how dangerous and powerful pornography is. I flip it on its head. I look at that same story and I say, wow, look how smart and self-aware these men were, that they could see their temptation to make a decision that they would later regret, and they were able to make a decision earlier to act, to make it easier for them to make a decision that they could accept and acknowledge and own. That's integrity. It has nothing to do with the porn. It has to do with the kind of person you are, the way you understand yourself, and what you're willing to do in your decisions.
I love all of that. That's great. So to take you on a little bit of a tangent, since you brought up some of the history of masturbation, and within our church construct that's still seen as sinful, can you give us a little bit of the history with masturbation and how that kind of comes to be? Maybe that's a whole nother podcast, but
it can be, but I think I think it's a desperately interesting kind of area, and I am very much a person who believes that if we don't understand our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think with masturbation, we kind of are right now. In the 1700s, a Swiss physician named Tissot published a monograph about masturbation, and he argued that masturbation, particularly men, none of these people really cared that much about women or female masturbation. But particularly in men, that masturbation caused the loss of vital fluids, and that these vital fluids depleted a man's moral character. In the late 1700s, Benjamin Rush was an American physician who signed the Declaration of Independence, and he believed that masturbation was deeply unhealthy. And we can credit Benjamin Rush for the invention of something we still believe or hear about today, the idea that masturbation will make you go blind. Benjamin Rush is the progenitor of that myth. And he treated masturbation with leeches. We don't need to talk about where he put the leeches. That is something that kind of changes the conversation. But in the mid to late 1800s, a couple of things were happening. First, the idea of nymphomania swept the country, and also hysterical. The belief that women suffered from hysteria, and the way to treat the hysteria was through hysterical paroxysms, which was basically a doctor masturbating the woman. But at the same time, Kellogg and Harvey Graham were doctors who invented foods that they believed would reduce the urge to masturbate. So Kellogg invented Kellogg's cornflakes and granola, and Graham invented graham crackers. Both of these were foods that, because they believed that spicy, tasty foods made people too focused on their body, on the sensual pleasures, and they believed that was unhealthy. Now, a few years later, about 50 years later, something was invented that changed the whole conversation. And that was antibiotics, because with antibiotics, all of a sudden we were able to effectively treat sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Now, syphilis and gonorrhea, when they are untreated, lead to a couple of things, including blindness and disorganized cognitive behaviors. What we think is that these doctors who were blaming masturbation as an illness that caused all of these problems, they were actually seeing people who were masturbating a lot that had sexually transmitted diseases. They didn't get the sexually transmitted diseases from masturbation, and they were blaming masturbation for the problem. Nowadays, research demonstrates very clearly that masturbation is the most common sexual behavior, that people who masturbate more live longer, have healthier lives, have healthier relationships, know their sexuality better, know their sexual response better, are able to use masturbation for very healthy things in their lives. Most people masturbate. And as they age and as society changes, more and more people are willing to acknowledge that. The sad thing is that there are still folks out there who are pathologizing masturbation. Some of the religious institutions obviously are some of those. But the modern discussion about porn addiction is actually a covert attack on masturbation, because when people watch porn, they don't just watch porn. They're watching porn and masturbating. So the idea of porn addiction is actually masturbation to porn addiction. And I think it's always important that we talk about that these attacks on pornography are actually covert attacks on masturbation. That there is this idea that masturbation to pornography somehow diminishes a person's sexual health, that it diminishes their response to their partner, and that pornography somehow plays a part in that. Now, I'm an older guy. In 1991, yeah, boy, it was long ago. In 1991, I started college at the University of Mississippi, and I can remember during my freshman orientation, they brought in a minister who railed against pornography, and he told us all that we should be afraid of pornography. And he told a story about a young husband that he knew who could only have sex with his wife if he had a Playboy centerfold laying on the bed next to him. He was blaming pornography for erectile dysfunction and for sexual problems before the pornography and porn-induced erectile dysfunction debates of today. There's nothing new about this. We need to recognize that, and recognize that these debates about porn are actually debates about masturbation, but even more so, they're debates about the conflict between our sexual values and the ability of people to have private sexuality outside our social control. When we look at it in that way, we can recognize this is a really important social dialogue and debate to have. It's not a healthcare one. It's not a public health crisis. It is a crisis. It's a moral crisis and a social crisis that we need to wrestle with, because otherwise we're abandoning people who can't live up to these ideals.
Well, going back to your concepts about monogamy and open relationships and morality and integrity, I mean, it's interesting that we just kind of assume that monogamous marriages have healthy sexuality within them. Like nobody's talking about unhealthy sexuality really within monogamy as much as we do with premarital sex or promiscuity or kink or these things that are assumed to be taking place outside of marriage.
Yeah, again, the modern world is a new one. Marriages and lifelong marriages nowadays are something that our ancestors did not see when the average lifespan was 45. Today, marriages that, can last 40 or 50 or 60 years is something very new. And we haven't quite wrestled with what does that mean in contrast to the idea of sexual fidelity. all of the bird species that we hold up as monogamous, whether we talk about swans or any of those birds that have been held up over time, even penguins, they're monogamous, they mate for life, they're committed to each other. Well, yeah, they do mate for life and they partner for life. But guess what? They're still having sex with other birds, because as they've done genetic studies with the offspring of these monogamous species, they find that behind closed nests, so to speak, these birds are copulating with other birds. So that there is a difference between monogamy and sexual fidelity. We have conflated those two concepts in a way that may not necessarily work with the modern world. Now, I'm different from a lot of people, because there are psychologists and sexual activists out there who argue that monogamy is not natural to human beings and that we should not be trying to coerce and force people into being monogamous. I don't know which one is true, I'll be honest. I do see, though, that for some people, monogamy and sexual fidelity work, and for other people, it doesn't. I think that the real issue here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, that the only way to really help our patients, the only way to really help each other, whether it's our spouses or our children, is to help people understand themselves, to know who they are. If you are a person, I tell patients this, if you are a person who has a high libido and a high desire for sensation seeking and excitement in life, then committing to monogamous marriage may be difficult for you. You may end up in a marriage and then get bored or sexually frustrated when your partner has other stuff going on in their life and they're not able to spend time with you or not interested in sex so much anymore. We need to help people understand that about themselves. Now, there are other people who are deeply aroused by connection with somebody that gets deeper over time. And that is a beautiful, wonderful, amazing thing when it happens. But we shouldn't be assuming that that's right and everybody else is wrong. Because as long as we try and fit everybody into that single box, we're going to fail lots of people, and we're going to end up with lots of people who feel ashamed and abandoned by us as therapists and by our religious and social groups that are telling us what's right and wrong.
I love that. So we're already doing this in a sense, but I know that you've been traveling a lot and presenting on this concept of modern sexuality. And so let's continue a bit of that discussion. What do you mean by that? What does sexuality have to offer? How can we define healthy sexuality? What are the roles of things like sexual fantasy and the differences? The big question, are there really differences between men and women? So I'm throwing a lot out there for you, but grab of that way you'd like.
I think that what we're learning is so many of the things that we didn't know, and that we didn't even know we didn't know them about sexuality. I mentioned one of them before, the knowledge that sexual diversity and sexual fantasies are so common that we thought were rare. One of the big remarkable things that I think is sort of on the horizon right now, and lots of therapists are seeing this, is the concept of sexual fluidity that is arising in our young people, where we have teens walking in the door and saying that they are gender fluid or pansexual or gender queer or transgender, and they are rejecting the idea of that male and female sexuality, that gay or straight. Basically, they're pushing back and saying, we don't want to choose one of those. Now, one of the ways our teens are learning about this is through the internet and through TV. So we have folks like Miley Cyrus that are out there, rejecting notions of straight or gay or male and female. And these kinds of concepts now really are opening the door for what I think is one of the next kind of social shifts as we're wrestling with, as our society, look at the transgender bathroom laws and such. We're really wrestling with these questions of what is gender, what is sex, what is sexual orientation, and these rigid concepts. Our young people are saying, wait a minute, these don't really apply. And we now are having to figure out, who's right? Therapists around the country are really struggling with that. I think this is a new conversation that is forcing us as a society to figure out how we are going to deal with these issues and how we are going to support our young people. I think that these issues are ones where we get to decide, are we going to abandon our young people and force them to try and fit into a box that no longer works? Or are we going to come into the new world and acknowledge that a lot of the things we believed about sexuality were based on our hopes and our morals and not reality? It's one of the reasons why I think that, the sex education debate is so critically important, because if we don't talk to kids about sexuality, if we don't invite them and explore with them what sexuality actually involves, they're going to go to pornography for answers. We can't stop that by trying to block pornography, because in fact what we'll do is we'll just make pornography more unhealthy and less regulated. Pornography will still be there. Instead, I think we need to prophylactically, I know that's a scary word for people, we need to give them a vaccine. And the way we give kids vaccines around sex is we educate them about what good, healthy sexuality is. We educate them about integrity and personal responsibility and self-understanding. Unfortunately, there's oftentimes the kind of social hope and belief that, well, if we just don't talk about it, it won't happen. It's that is a sad and oftentimes I think scary self-defeating belief, because if we don't talk about these things and if we pretend they're not happening, in fact, they will happen. We just won't know about it until things really blow up and catastrophic results occur.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, I know that I've had you on for longer than we had anticipated and that you have to go. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and being willing to come on the program. Can you close us off with any closing thoughts that you might want to leave us with?
Well, I'm actually going to be in Salt Lake City on May 13th, Friday, and I'm speaking around these issues and around helping to move the conversation forward around pornography. The title of the talk is Beyond Porn Addiction, and that's what we really want to, I think, explore, is enough with the debate about whether porn is a disease or not. Instead, let's talk about how we can help the people that are struggling. Because as we debate this issue, we lose those folks who need our help. I think now the time for the conversation is to sit down and talk with them about what help they need. I don't think that help is actually around preventing pornography use. It's actually around helping them to resolve the conflicts in their life between their morality, their religion, their relationship, and pornography and the sexual opportunity that is available in the world today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
We took the long road home turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.